Welcome everyone to this webinar today. This is one of our usual webinars that we normally do on Tuesday evenings, where we discuss some of the big issues that face us nationally, internationally and locally as well. And in this particular webinar, we're going to look at intergenerational issues. Intergenerational issues have become a sort of big topic nowadays because we know that many of the problems that face us, education, social care, equality, have intergenerational implications. Education, very often older people pay for younger people. Social care, younger people pay for older people. And that can lead to conflicts. And what we're going to particularly look at today is how these sort of issues of intergenerational work and so on impact on what is called the Sustainable Development Goals, which are goals set up by the United Nations to be implemented by 2030 to try and get a fairer world in a whole wide area. There's 16, 17 sort of goals on that, and they deal with health and education and gender equality and good water and environment and so on. Now, how can we get intergenerational work on that? How can we get the generations to work together? Well, we've got Harriet Marshall with us today, who is the leader of the Global Goals program. And she's going to take us through the work she's done on this and how she's looked at how we can take it further so that we can develop it internationally, nationally, and also important for all of us locally as well. So I'm going to pass over to Harriet now, who's going to talk to us and then give us a small PowerPoint presentation. And when she's finished, please put your questions up and then we'll put those to Harriet. So Harriet, thank you for joining with us today, and over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so my name's Harriet Marshall. I'm one of 4 national leaders on something called the Global Learning Programme. It's one of the hats I wear, which is a government-funded education programme that's been running for 5 years. It's coming to an end now, but has nearly 8,000 schools in England alone registered, and has been engaging with issues of global citizenship, 21st century skills and competencies within schools. And I've always worked in schools. My specialist area is in global citizenship education, global learning. And the last few years, well, since the emergence of the SDGs, which are 17 goals, as Francis said, with 169 targets coming out in 2015 with the aim of reaching these by 2030. And they concern all countries around the world. Within that context, we've found that getting global issues, global topics into educational contexts it's been a great framework to work with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience coming from that background, because some of the most interesting projects I've begun to see emerge are where you get cross-sector and intergenerational work, because a lot of these themes and topics and issues are not ones that are straightforwardly hierarchical in the pedagogical model that you might use, for example. It's where young people and older generations go on a learning journey together, and in immensely powerful ones in some contexts. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm a sociologist by background and an educationist, and I'm more familiar with school systems, but I'm learning, and I'm hope to flag up a text or two that I think is really useful for finding, exactly as Francis was saying, how we can get better at intergenerational things within this context. And a context being, and I'm just going to quote from one of the books I'm going to mention later, is that globally the number of older persons, that's age 60 and over, is expected to more than double from 841 million people in 2013 to more than 2 billion in 2050. And older persons are projected to exceed the number of children for the first time in 2047. So that's just the sheer number that we're talking about. We've got the shifts and changes between intergenerational groupings. We're going to see lots of that. And so for those of us that are actively involved in projects like climate change or related to reducing inequality or working towards social justice. If we to do these truly collaboratively, we have my argument, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, we need to do it a little bit more intergenerationally. So I'm going to share the screen, if this works. They're the goals. If you're not familiar with them, I think that's for another time. By all means, message me or Francis, and I can send you many links. There are the 17 goals, and there's lots of introductory videos. For many of you, maybe you're very familiar with them, in which case I'm not going to go along with too much of a basic introduction. But if I can move to the next slide. It's not letting me. Well, the top quote there on the right-hand side, I can read it anyway. It's from Gaylord Nelson, who was an American politician, is an environmentalist. And the ultimate test of man's, and I'm going to put sick there, a conscience may be his willingness to sacrifice something today for future generations whose words of thanks will not be heard. And I think that's the crux of some of these issues, is dealing with future problems that don't immediately affect those people who are working to solve them. And it's an age-old thing in society and societal change. So addressing the most significant challenges today, such as poverty and inequality, education, the environment, healthcare, and many other themes reflected in the UN's global goals for sustainable development, I'll go back to them. They're also nicknamed the SDGs, by the way, requires collaborative work at a local, national and international scale. But sometimes I think we approach these issues with passionate but siloed solutions, which are never quite enough to really address the problems at scale. And the other quote there, which is merged, and apologies, was from an article that I read that I thought was quite good, by Becker and Smith, that the grand challenges of our time present a striking opportunity for new processes of co-creating change and new outcomes. And in recent years, we've seen an increased focus on public-private partnerships and the rise of collaborative structures. In other words, we're seeing the rise of cross-sector collaborations and alliances with non-profits, governments, philanthropic, business sectors, with diverse perspectives, resources to jointly solve a societal problem and achieve a shared goal. And many of us are working within this world of trying to get different sectors, different voices working more together on common agendas. And in sustainability and global learning, I'll just come out of that a minute, stop share. So in sustainability and global learning here in the UK, from my experience, we're definitely getting better at working across sectors. And I don't know if anyone is familiar with the work of UKSSD. They've just published a very significant measuring report on how the UK is doing, again, working with lots of different sectors and organisations to produce that. We're also getting better at forming organically emerging movements like Global Net 21, like this one, like SDG Meetup Network, which I've been gone along to a couple of in London, and a movement I'm involved in called #TeachSDGs, which is a collaboration of teachers and educators all around the world who have, it's emerged predominantly through social media and Twitter actually, to share ideas and practices and examples of what works in different contexts and in different environments. And what we've been learning from some of the teachers and educationalists in other countries, not so much actually in the UK and the States, is that community working, community collaboration on awareness raising on some of these issues and then moving to action and social justice is invariably an intergenerational phenomena, and much more so and outside of the boundaries of institutions, for example. So I think there's lots of exciting things happening. In cross-sector and intergenerational collaboration, difference is seen as an asset. So difference in perspective, difference in experience, collaboration, differences in knowledge and all that sort of thing. But even when we might have a common agenda, difference is a tricky one to navigate without an understanding of power dynamics and the best strategies for building trust. For example, breaking down the multitude of stereotypes and partial truths at play before anything can get going. And that's where I think facilitating and creating safe spaces for genuine intergenerational work. And the book I'm about to mention, actually, by Matt Kaplan and a couple of his colleagues, differentiates between involvement and engagement in intergenerational work. And I think that's really interesting. If we return to the slides. So this is the book. Sorry, the image is not great. And it recently came out at the beginning of this year, Intergenerational Pathways to a Sustainable Society. And I do recommend it. The central argument is that strong intergenerational relationships are not only at the root of healthy and productive aging, they are also an important component of sustainable and livable societies. The essence of the intergenerational lens, which is the lens they advocate we begin to consider a little bit more seriously, is that it's not so much a matter of drawing attention to age per se, but rather the relationships between people in different generational positions and the significance of those relationships in order to promote, maybe it might be social cohesion or whatever the end goal is for a better collaboration. And as I say, they differentiate between involvement and engagement, where involvement is just being literally just number on a seat, or so, or we've got a representative from there, and the engagement is where they feel fully involved. So an intergenerational approach then to collaboration is simultaneously age-friendly and youth-friendly. It has an awareness of intergenerational interdependence and difference in order to build a capacity for change. And the global goals, I would argue then, are about rights, sustainability, let's get out of this again, well-being and countering social exclusion. And we can't have the invisibility of the youngest and the oldest generations. I'm somewhere firmly in the middle. Some of the projects forget those bookend generations, I guess. And I've certainly become increasingly aware of the invisibility of certain voices and perspectives, and even when we do say, well, let's give the younger generation a voice, and notice I do say give, because sometimes I think we are in the position of power as gatekeepers in this exercise. Do we really give them power? I was at an SDG action event, so the Sustainable Development Goals action event, in March this year in Bonn, and it was really brilliant. There was lots of wonderful groups and organisations and people that shared all the fantastic activities they've been doing to both promote awareness of the goals and then move towards action and social change and meeting those targets. And there was quite a lot of youth-led projects actually, and campaigns to raise awareness and act and take action. My concern sometimes is that we're conceptualizing some of the Sustainable Development Goals as a youth problem, and it wasn't unusual to hear at the events the sentiments, well, we need these youth groups because it's their world that we're screwing up, sort of thing. But it's all of our world, and I really didn't hear so much from representatives of older generations, and actually that was only sort of noticed towards the end, that voice was missing. So without wishing to go into too much depth, I think we're all increasingly aware that the age divide, that's coming up in the press in lots of different ways, and the need to build bridges where necessary. We need to recognise and move beyond stereotypes. That takes careful facilitation from my experience and my knowledge of the theories of development education, for example. The joy, I think, of these global goals, Sustainable Development Goals, is that we're all on, as I said earlier, on a fairly equal learning journey. The data, the technology is changing at such a pace. None of us are experts. What we know, and what Kaplan et al. Evidence in that book, is that the broader the age range of the group, the greater capacity for living testimony of change over time and life spectrum perspectives. And I think this is one of the motivations and benefits. Also, the intergenerational lens, particularly important in UK and Ireland, actually, when you look at more deeply at the issues of health and well-being and inequality gaps. So this webinar is linked to a seminar around a few weeks ago in London, and we had the director of the Equalities Trust, and we had the head of the Sustainable Development Goals. Anyway, they were exemplifying, particularly they focused on SDG 10, which is reducing inequalities, and some of the really quite overt issues between the inequalities with our very much younger generations and our older generations. So what about the Sustainable Development Goals? I think there's a number of critiques of these goals. A significant one has been that they are so enormous and they're so complex that they are actually quite unhelpful when it comes to action. I've been aware of these critiques, but my experience is somewhat different. I've worked, taught, researched in this field of global learning and development education pretty much all my adult life, really. And I've never seen a global issues framework that is so effective for engaging new audiences and bringing together new partnerships from a wide range of themes. Last 5 years, as I said, I've been working on this government-funded global learning programme, which has been actively supporting schools to engage more deeply with global issues. And for some, global learning sometimes is called global citizenship education or education for sustainable development. And it's become, like, in some amazing examples in some schools, the golden thread of a whole school approach. The last couple of years, as I've said, the SDGs have become a very helpful framework. They've engaged new audiences, but they've also engaged parents and community groups as well. I know that sustainability colleagues in other sectors have also found this, that the framework has allowed a mapping of initiatives already in existence and a fresh awareness of the strengths and gaps. And they've generated action plans, for example, for whole organisational change or at a whole organisational level and an individual level. And my social media feeds, I'm sure lots of you, has been awash with both corporate projects and policies relating to plastic and waste, for example. And a quick thanks to Blue Planet for that one. And actually that example was a really good one because it got different generations talking together over, like at Christmas time. I know it was a topic at our Christmas dinner table between children and older generations. And it doesn't always have to be those two polars either, obviously it can be everyone in between. So in my field, global development education, we've always considered many lenses to or approaches, if you like, to engagement and innovation for our global challenges. Social justice lens, a human rights lens, environmental, intercultural, gender lens. These are just examples. And I suppose my point here is perhaps it's time we start more proactively adding an additional intergenerational lens, which necessitates a historical and a futures perspective. And the question is, of course, how do we then create an integrated vision across boundaries and facilitate sharing of visions for the future, when, going back to that original quote I started with, the ultimate test of our conscience is our willingness to sacrifice something in many ways and to put effort into something for future generations that you might not necessarily reap the benefits from, the age-old issue in education for sustainable development. So I think I've talked a lot, so I don't want to talk too much more. I think I sort of hit the 20 minutes there. Because we could go lots of different ways here, and I'm happy to go whatever way people want to in terms of their particular interests and perspectives. I think that was more just sort of setting the scene and the context for why it's become a bit of an interest of mine, and I know other people's, and a conversation topic that hasn't been massively talked about in this context of sustainability yet.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. I mean, that gives us a really, really good idea of what you're doing and also what your passion is as well and what motivates you. And you know, that's important when you're doing something. what I'm sort of interested in, and I'm sure we'll get questions coming up. We've got some certainly come up on Facebook, and we've got a couple coming up on our webinar system. But what I wanted to ask you, first of all, listening to you, is are you using SDGs to encourage intergenerational work, or are you using intergenerational work to further the development of sustainable goals? Do you have a sort of end game in this?
I think they have, as the book argues, they sort of have to happen simultaneously. I think an intergenerational vision is a sustainable vision, and a sustainable vision has to, in order to work effectively and be truly collaborative, has to be intergenerational. The intergenerational side of the intergenerational lens, if you like, is fairly new to my area of interest, and it's been stimulated by some of the projects I've been seeing that schools have been engaged in. And now I'm beginning to go more broadly into other areas. For example, I had a really interesting chat with some colleagues from St Monica's Trust who received some publicity for their project where they have a nursery inside their homes for older people, and it's really fascinating how it enhanced well-being and all sorts of other spin-offs and thinking behind it. But that's it's trying to bring some of those ideas and those more successful social cohesion ideas in a more global issues context, which is a tricky thing to do. But I suppose achieving some of the sustainable development goals is particularly important to me. If I can just share the screen, I didn't show this slide, which I will just do. So the two targets particularly relate to number 4, which is quality education. And so there's many sub-targets in quality education, and 4.7 is where I've always been working in. And this is this idea that by 2030, we need to ensure all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among other things, through education for sustainable development, human rights, gender equality, promoting culture of peace, non-violence, etc., etc. You can read it there. And that's where a lot of the work I've been doing sits quite firmly. In fact, some of us were involved in supporting and framing that. But 10.2 is where I'm beginning to drift, and actually well-being, goal 3, good health and well-being, and 10, where these are issues particularly specific to a UK context, actually, which is linked to empowering and promoting social and economic and political inclusion of all people, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, and economic status. If you look at some of our statistics and our reports, and we don't do quite so well in some of these areas as, in the UK, and other countries fare better for sure.
So when you're looking at sustainable development goals, they're different from the old millennial goals, for example. The old millennial goals were assuming that development had to take place in the underdeveloped world, whereas the sustainable development goals includes everyone, including us, having those goals. Now you talked in your presentation about the problem of scale, and that becomes important when you're dealing with international, national, or community. So what's your concentration on? Are you looking at how you can deal with SDGs at an international level, or are you looking at how communities locally can work towards those goals? When you're helping people, when you're advising people, what's your focus?
Personally, at the moment, it's more about raising awareness and engaging with the sustainable development goals within a young person's context. But the Teach SDGs movement is a global one. So that would be, I'm moving and shifting more into the international arena, I would say.
So you're actually moving into the international arena. Okay. I mean, Michelle, for example, asks, is intergenerational work more difficult in northern countries because the intergenerational conflicts and divides are greater than they are in southern countries where the family is a much closer unit?
It's actually something that's a question that sort of came up at our meeting. There wasn't enough representation from other countries to give informed response to that, and my hypothesis, my guess, and from some of the things I've read about community-based upbringing of children and all sorts of things, is that would be true. We have a division. There's lots of statistics, as far as I understand, about how isolated, for example, people end up when they come to having babies and bringing up their children away from their family groups and things, and that can lead to social exclusion and feeling of loneliness and all sorts of well-being issues, as well as economic issues. I suspect it may well be more of an issue in countries where we're not so good at working in collaborative community groups from the outset. We live in a more individualized society, arguably, than some others. So it's a good question. I can only get...
Yeah, okay, no, they're all good questions that people put up. The problem is having to answer them. I mean, Sonia, if you want to say anything, please do you? Or do you just want to listen in?
Oh, you've unmuted me. Okay.
I've unmuted you.
Actually, I had a question along the same lines in terms of cultures, because I've just always assumed that, for instance, Southern European cultures are more family orientated. So I thought that was a really interesting question. Although I take your point, Harriet, about cultures where there's more collaborative community set up is as important as family, I suppose. The only thing that, from what you were saying before, the only thing that I just wanted some clarity around, actually, so it's not necessarily a question, but you mentioned genuine intergenerational work. What are you seeing as the not so genuine? What are the two different things? That's interesting.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. I think, it's going back to this division between involvement and engagement. Yeah. So we know we can tokenistically say that we had this number of people in the age 18 to 25 bracket and 9 to 11 bracket, and we had this many people in 60 plus bracket or whatever. To what extent they were genuinely engaged in an activity or project, and to what extent they were there as a sort of wise person sitting in the corner and not really saying very much. That's an element of, that's where it comes to this really interesting process. And I suppose that goes back to your question, Francis. What I'm interested in is, how do we best facilitate genuine collaboration to work towards goals and social change and improvement? What rules of the game do we need to employ, if you like? Yeah, what practices seem to work to facilitate a genuine dialogue in a safe space where everyone feels like they're able to maybe bring up a stereotype or dispel a myth about oh, well, you're old, so you know nothing about how to work this particular technology, or similarly the opposite myth that young people know everything about technology, but you have to create spaces that people feel safe and empowered to lay down some ground rules of openness and genuine dialogue that facilitates a genuine, so again, this use of the word genuine, collaboration that is not just involvement, it is genuine engagement, or at least that people feel that they're able to engage, whether they choose to. Well, that's another matter.
I mean, you mentioned the technology issue. We've had a couple of questions come up which relate to the different sort of views that different generations have, the different mindsets they come to this with. I mean, for example, Michelle says that the older generation will have a different view about economic growth than the younger generation, and their expectations of whether they will have that growth or not will be different. And Gary Kusalulu on Facebook has raised I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I think it's from Sonia. She's raised the question of technology again. You know, people have a different pedagogy on generations. Young people learn in a different way. They learn almost in an intuitive sort of flashpoint, image to image way, rather than in an analog way, which someone of my generation might. Now, those are problems that you have to overcome, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. But everyone also has different learning styles, regardless of age and learning preferences. But yes, there's a different immersive learning techniques that young people might be more adept to than older generations. And certainly that's another really interesting point, actually, this idea of a learning journey, that everyone's going on a learning journey simultaneously. So injecting a little bit of theory of learning into these collaborations and innovations and practices, I think, is really, really useful, and one of these methods we need to get better at. And it's linked to lifelong learning, and that sort of understanding that with an aging population and better healthcare, those transition points in life are more frequent. It's not just about turning 40 or just turning 21. There are many, many transition points. There are many shifts and changes, and conceptualizing life as a learning journey and our well-being linked to making a difference somehow, which again is another correlation that is very interesting in these contexts, that if we feel like we're actively making a difference somehow, it will be in a small way. But this, yeah, I don't think there was really necessarily a question there, was there? But it's the learning theory stuff is important, and we need to be aware of that. And again, that comes from creating a space that everyone feels like they can be honest about what their preferred styles are, or where they might need help, or where their gaps are, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said in your presentation two important things that you think are a part of developing an intergenerational project or approach. One is creating safe space, and the other is co-creation. Now, have you got a good example of how you brought those together and made it work?
Most of my examples are just from observation of what's been happening with other people. I am yet to properly facilitate some of this. I'm sitting there taking it all in, reading up to here of theories and ideas, and collecting other people's perspectives. The ones that I think work particularly effectively is when there is the co-creation. The deciding of what the issue is in the first place has to be democratic and collaborative from the outset. So in school context, for example, you know, teachers may have a preference for one of those goal themes depending on what their area of expertise and interest is, inevitably. The braver teachers are those that say, okay, let's open this out, let's look at the other options. What is interesting to you? So right from the decision of what topic, issue, social problem, global problem that you want to address, that collaboration has to be there, and actually and the ownership of the co-ownership of the agenda and the co-ownership of the presentation and that side of things, and to not be so worried about it being not just the children standing up front doing the presentation, for example, that it can be a collaborative effort.
Yeah, Gary has sort of kind of given some examples that he's involved in. He says he's taken on 700 young people for work experience, and if you organise work experience the right way, you can have a really good co-creative collaborative framework. And he also talks about schools where, in his area where he lives, older people come into schools to help out, and you create that sort of intergenerational work there. And I know examples of where younger people have gone into older people's homes and worked with them. And there are some cases where student flats have been built alongside old people's homes. They get cheap rent in order to go in and work with the older people. Are those the sort of examples that you're looking at and you think should be, encouraged?
Yeah, there's some of those projects in Netherlands, isn't there? And renting a room and in exchange for being that social support and other caring roles. Yeah, I think there's lots out there. That sounds interesting. The careers angle and work exchange. Yes, there's lots of ways there. I'm thinking of another example now in my head, but I'm not sure I can talk about it this moment. It's on a leadership program within a company that's working with other groups, and it has intergenerational at its heart.
I've just thought of something actually, which was just, I don't know if you've seen it, Harriet. I think it was a report done by Demos. Is it Demos? I think.
Possibly.
About older people who were interviewed feeling very isolated by technology. I haven't read it extensively. It was just something that I browsed through, and I just thought it was really interesting because I hear you when you're saying, we can't just default to the assumptions that older people aren't fluent with technology and younger people are. But I know that my 80-year-old mother, for instance, whilst she does email and she does have a mobile phone, she gets very overwhelmed by it all.
Yeah.
So I just thought it was interesting browsing very quickly through that Demos report. But it was just something I thought of as you were speaking.
But see, that has a link to well-being, doesn't it? Which I would immediately.
Yes.
I link everything to one of the SDGs. Sometimes.
Oh yeah.
And the health and well-being thing, and the sort of isolation or feeling overwhelmed or out of touch, not being able to communicate in the way that other people are, and it is not just the very old or the very young. It's people in between too, and that's the thing. Similarly, my mum comes to see my children and gets her computer out and just says to my son, "So, what's happened here? Can you sort this out for me?" But it's not. That to some extent stereotype. All stereotypes are linked to truths, but there's other truths, and the facilitation of co-learning, again, that lifelong learning journey theme, if we were more familiar with it from school onwards, that learning does not stop when you leave school. We are eternally on a learning journey, and actually that can be very empowering, and part of a learning journey is unlearning. It's thinking about your assumptions and all the knowledge and understanding that you've had and built up, and questioning that, and maybe shifting it slightly by engaging in learning experiences with other people, and beyond the just narrow boundaries of subjects and compartmentalized subjects at universities or schools or something like that, the wider lifelong learning and the 21st century skills and competencies that for example PISA is talking about, that we're going to need to be better at helping young people have, that don't strictly link to core knowledges that are about being able to be much more flexible and shift from role to role as technology changes the workplace at a scale and a pace we can't keep up with. We have no idea what young people are going to be doing in 5-10 years time, what roles are going to be out there, but the collaboration and sort of understanding of more of a historical and futures perspectives might help us.
Okay, Michelle asked, examples, for example, of creative art projects which have created a safe space for people and allowed people across generations to engage in dialogue?
Not off the top of my head, but I think the creative art projects in lots of different contexts there's some amazing ones. There's some amazing ones in mental health and well-being that I know about, but that aren't explicitly intergenerational, I guess. But I suspect they are as a happy sort of circumstance that does happen. I'm sure an awful lot of projects out there are intergenerational. We've got a range of generations. So to what extent there's an awareness of that being an issue, if it is, if it isn't, if it's, to what extent we're aware that we might be in a silo to some extent, and what we might do to broaden that out. But I think the arts would be a wonderful example of how there might be great work.
We did a webinar a little while ago with Dhruv Patel from the Nisai Foundation, which is a school that deals with kids who've been excluded. They work with local authorities and they work with others. And he's come to the conclusion that SDGs are a way to involve those kids, often who work from home. They're learning from home. They meet people in groups as well. They look at SDGs, their parents and other generations come in. So he's trying to develop a project around exclusion that includes SDGs and that involves intergenerational work. Now, is that the sort of thing that you have in mind?
I know of a similar project actually that's done by a school in the southwest that is a school for young boys with special educational needs, but also some of whom have been excluded, and they have done fantastic work on sustainability with community groups. And it's also about dispelling myths about some of the issues that those young people have themselves, and it's all been through a growing and sustainability in relation to food. That was been their theme, and they've done community events where they've got people to come in and so again, I mean, that wasn't explicitly intergeneration, but it involved different generations, and you know, pushing them one step further from my point of view would be to say, okay, so you've managed to do this through sustainability lens, you've got different awareness of gender perhaps, but have you got an awareness of the different perspectives that are coming from different age groups? So yeah, I think that sort of thing is fabulous.
I mean, it's quite interesting, you know, listening to what you say, but when you've got, you know, groups, older generation, younger generation, those like yourself in the middle, I mean, you start with involvement, you then go to engagement, you get them to collaborate, and then you move to action. Tell us a bit more how you get that process going, because they're easy words to say, but what does it mean in practice?
Yeah, I think we need to know more, and I think in order to know more, we need to make these things happen. That's part of what I'm doing with a project I'm working on called Partner Up at the moment. And that involves facilitating things and getting people interested in them in the first place. The book that I mentioned earlier cites some fantastic examples of case studies and practice, and it has a recommendation of a way of working, a way of practice, and a sort of sequencing of what needs to happen first, and ideas of how models of practice and of how that might work, and the creation, the spaces that this happens is quite important. The physical spaces, who owns those physical spaces and who feels empowered by them. As I mentioned earlier, the choosing of the topics, if that's genuinely something that's come externally or emerged internally, either way, do people feel like they've bought, that they co-own it, or to what extent has it been imposed? I think that the creative autonomy, creative power to take things in a different direction and create new collaborations, and this associated training that might be required to enhance the skills that are needed to do that. So say you need to go and make a better relationship with an NGO or charity that is also working on the same project, who would be best placed to do that, and would they need more support and facilitation? So I can't say much more than that, because I haven't got a huge amount of experience of things that are explicitly having intergeneration. A lot of them are projects that were school-based or learning-based or community-based, but that as a happy byproduct, they were also intergenerational, but that theme emerged as a more important one.
But it's difficult, isn't it? Because you talked about things growing organically, like your own organisation, Teach SDGs or Global Net 21. We're very good at getting people involved. We can get members easily to sign up to Facebook, to meet up, to whatever. moving them to the next stage of engagement is much more difficult. You're only going to get a tiny percentage of those doing that. And then moving them further to action, we're going to get a tiny percentage of those who are engaged to action. So you've got sort of diminishing returns. And how can you do that without people feeling discouraged?
By celebrating, by doing our very best and using whatever channels or platforms that seem to be best for that particular group of people. I mean, I've really seen, even just through Twitter actually, how a celebration of achievements that schools now more often than not share a project, even if it's just an image and a quote and a link to a little blog or something like that. And there's a sense of pride in that, and there's a sense of celebration and recognition. I think we can do more of that as facilitators, but invariably all this stuff is voluntary. You know this. Everything that I do in that world is for the love.
Right. I mean, one of the problems of action and getting people together, you know, we find is, you know, we're trying to move from involvement to engagement to action, where people want to take action. We're thinking of doing that online, digitally, developing digital action groups, but there we've got a generation conflict. And how do you overcome that? Facebook Facebook is becoming the medium of the older generation now, and Snapchat and Instagram of the younger generation.
And WhatsApp.
So getting in these sort of digital action groups going is a problem in itself. How do you do it? How do you cross the generation divide when generations are using different digital media?
Mm-hmm. The platforms, I don't think it's just a generational thing. I do also think that it is about different environments, different sectors working with different things. So, for example, when we're trying to get out some of the messages on the Sustainable Development Goals with schools, we can't use YouTube because schools don't use YouTube. A lot of schools in the UK have filters. So, but in different environments, that's the way to go. But in terms of communication, I think we need to put that out to the experts to see which mode and platform works best with different environments. I would say, though, it's not always generationally linked, that it's actually more to do with the sector as to what works best. We've certainly found in our global learning programme that the email, for example, is not something teachers particularly prefer to use. But getting them registered onto a website where we can facilitate chats and things might work better.
I know, it's really quite disconcerting when you're my age and you realised how new email was once and how excited you were about it. And now it's old hat and people don't want to use it too much. And I use it and people don't answer and I wonder why. And I get an answer on Twitter. And that's how it goes now. But that's an intergenerational thing. And getting people together and to use a network that they use together is important in the sense that you need, and you stress this and maybe want to say something more about it, it needs trust. Trust is the element of any intercommunal work of any kind, whether it's generational or gender or community or whatever. I mean, how can you emphasize that trust is important, and how do you generate that trust?
Trust is, yes, massively important. And I think, again, it goes to buy-in with the rules of the game and co-ownership of those rules, as opposed to those being top down and manufactured externally. If there's a sense of co-ownership of the how the methods of working and the projects that and the ultimate goals and objectives of a project, then you're going to give your best stab at making trust a strong thing. Yeah.
Well, I do have one question. What are the quick wins, do you think, Harriet?
Good question. Well, you mean in terms of sustainability and intergenerational collaboration and sustainable development goals, or generally intergenerational work?
I think generally, and thinking about the more domestic issues, especially around pressing issues such as care, especially for the older generation. What do you think are the quick wins?
Well, I think so many of the problems come about through a lack of understanding and knowledge and a lack of empathy, right? And that to get around that, it's about challenging stereotypes, dispelling myths, all the stuff I was talking about earlier, and being allowing people to voice their concerns and expressions about, I don't know, perceived. So let's take the elephant in the room, Brexit, and the generational divide on voting over that. Quite a significant barrier has been put up between certain generations. I'm sure you will know someone, I certainly know a number of people who have pretty much fallen out with their aunts or uncles or whatever over positions on Brexit, or it's got in the way of and it's perceived as a generational thing in some ways, and there's been articles on it. But some of the those sorts of issues, you wonder if it's because it's a lack of communication or a lack of feeling like you can honestly express yourself in that context. It's such a heated, divisive issue. The joy of the Sustainable Development Goals, I think, is that possibly some of the topics don't necessarily have to be ones on your doorstep. They can be more global issues that affect a wider number of people, and they also have implications for your local environment, but they are global topics that you can relate into. But I think the quick wins are well, there probably aren't any, but I think possibly starting with themes and topics that are maybe distant. It's called a distancing pedagogic technique in schools, where you've got a typical controversial issue you need to get into the classroom somehow, but you don't want to talk about exactly what's happening down the road, but you can talk about, say, racism or xenophobia or whatever in a different context that then inevitably leads to bringing it to a local one. So I do think that those might be using those distancing.
Okay, well, we're coming close to the end. So let me ask you the last question. I mean, you talked about the lenses we use to sort of recognize the world around us, and they're lenses that we try to become more and more apparent in terms of understanding that world, like gender, like race, ethnicity, and so on. But you were saying that we should now have intergenerational lens is also an important one, equally as important as any of the others. Ageism is becoming, for example, an issue which people, I've seen people who, defend, gender and racial equality and so on, and become very ageist, and they don't think. How do we actually know that we're succeeding in that? Are we getting the lens of intergenerational perception now accepted, or is that still work to do?
Oh, I think we've definitely got work to do. It's when I've only really, it's fairly recently an interest of mine in the scheme of things, and when you start talking to people about it as a topic within the global education, broader field of global education, people are, oh yes, we don't really talk about that very much, do we? And we don't really raise it as an issue that might be at play, might be a variable at play in power dynamics and all sorts of things when we talk about collaboration. So I think we've got a long way to go, personally. I don't know, what do you think, you two?
I think we have a long way to go, yes, but I think we're developing it, and I think people are more aware of it now. So I think the work you're doing is very, very important. We're going to end now. Do you want to say something on that, Sonia? Or
well, just to say, I agree. I think there is a long way to go, but kind of naturally anyway, because these are long-term goals, aren't they? But I'm interested to know and gather more information on it, because I'm sure there must be quick wins.
Certainly the place to start, isn't it? Low-hanging fruit. Pick with that. Go from
absolutely.
that first.
yeah, so.
Anyhow, I'm just going to end the webinar now because we sort of come to the end of our time.
You've frozen.
So thank you, you know, everyone for taking part, those who've come on the webinar platform, those who have joined us on Facebook.
I will wave.
Go out and stay on Facebook, and obviously people will keep watching it, and the viewings always go up by day for at least a week. And I hope tomorrow or the next day we'll also turn it into a YouTube video, and it will be uploaded to YouTube as well, so you'll be able to see it that way as well. Anyhow, thank you for doing it, Harriet. Thank you for joining us.
Once all the football's on, I wonder, let's go and watch the football now.
Well, thank you for joining us as well, Sonia, and for your first experience of taking part in a webinar.
Thank you.
It surprised me when you came on in video, but it was a nice surprise, so that was okay. Anyhow, thanks a lot for doing it, and thanks for everyone. So I'm going to officially end the webinar now, and I hope you'll join us next week when I think we're doing a webinar which looks at women and public space and how women get involved in trying to protect and develop public space on a global level. Anyhow, thank you for joining us, and hope to see you next week.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.